The 60s and 70s were a time of revolution, civil rights, free love, and war protests. But while men like Mick Jagger and Jim Morrison were celebrated for their rebellion, women who did the same were scandalized. They were seen as too loud, too wild, too sexual, too political. They were arrested, blacklisted, banned from radio stations, and torn apart by the press. And yet, they kept going. From psychedelic rock queens to disco divas. These women didn't just challenge the system, they shattered it. And some paid the price with their careers. Join us as we take a look at the 10 most controversial female singers of the 60s and 70s. Number 1. Janis Joplin.
Oh, she's looking pretty fine to me now. Yeah.
Janis Joplin wasn't just a singer, she was a force of nature. A whirlwind of raw blues and psychedelic rock, sweat-drenched performances, and an electric presence that burned bright and fast. But beyond the music, she was a walking rebellion, a middle finger to the buttoned-up norms of her era, and that made her dangerous. In the 1960s, women in music were expected to be polished, controlled, perhaps a little seductive, but always in a way that was palatable to men. Joplin shattered that mold, with her untamed rasp of a voice, unkempt hair, and a laugh that could shake a barroom. She embraced every taboo: casual sex, heavy drinking, drugs, and a refusal to tone herself down for anyone. She swigged Southern comfort straight from the bottle, prowled stages and flamboyant thrift store chic, and ran with the wildest crowd in rock. Her voice, half scream, half soul-wrenching plea, tore through the era's most anthemic tracks. Piece of My Heart, Bobby McGee, Summertime. Each song bled with a kind of vulnerability that made people uncomfortable. She sang like she was exorcising demons. Maybe she was. But it wasn't just her sound that rattled conservative America. It was her unapologetic defiance of traditional femininity. She didn't want to be anyone's delicate flower. She wanted to howl with the wolves. She openly discussed her bisexuality in an era where it was still whispered about. She partied harder than most of her male contemporaries, and she didn't care who judged her. The press branded her reckless, self-destructive. They scrutinized her weight, her looks, her voice. They labeled her the ugly duckling of rock. But Janis wasn't out to be pretty. She was out to be free. Her defiance came at a cost. The pressure, the loneliness, the grueling pace of her career. It all drove her deeper into substance abuse. On October 4th, 1970, she was found dead in a Los Angeles hotel room, a heroin overdose. She was 27. But in death, her legend only grew. Joplin didn't just break the rules, she set them on fire. In doing so, she paved the way for every female rock rebel who came after her. Number 2. Yoko Ono. No woman in rock history has been more demonized than Yoko Ono. For decades, she was the villain, the woman who stole John Lennon from the world, the siren who lured him away from the Beatles, the whispering force behind the band's disintegration. But peel back the layers of mythology and you'll find a woman whose mere presence in rock and roll was a controversy in itself. Before she ever met Lennon, Yoko Ono was already an avant-garde artist pushing boundaries. A conceptual mastermind, she blurred the lines between music, performance, and activism. She staged Cut Piece, where audience members were invited to cut off pieces of her clothing, bringing to the spotlight objectification and vulnerability in both art and life. She created Grapefruit, a book of surreal, zen-like instructions that redefined what art could be. And then there was her music. Ono didn't make pop songs. She made soundscapes, eerie wails, primal screams set against jagged instrumentals. Tracks like Don't Worry, Kyoko and Why weren't just weird, they were challenging. She pushed music into the unknown. Critics called it unlistenable, but her influence bled into punk, noise rock, even electronic music. Decades later, artists like Bjork and Sonic Youth would cite her as a trailblazer. But in the late 60s, none of that mattered. What mattered was that she was a woman, an outsider, and worst of all, she had the audacity to fall in love with a Beatle. The backlash was immediate and vicious. Racism, misogyny, and blind loyalty to the Beatles combined into a storm of hatred. She was accused of being manipulative, of brainwashing John, of destroying the greatest band in history. When Lennon and Ono staged their famous Bed In for Peace, lying in a hotel bed for a week as a protest against war, the press mocked them. When they recorded the unfinished music albums, stripped down, experimental, bizarre, they were ridiculed. Lennon never wavered. He saw in Ono what the world refused to see, a fearless innovator, a woman unwilling to conform. Together they crafted Imagine and Walking on Thin Ice, songs that pushed boundaries, songs that forced people to think. And still, the world hated her. Even after Lennon's assassination in 1980, the venom didn't fade. But history, as it often does, has begun to rewrite the narrative. Today, Yoko Ono is recognized as a pioneering force in art and music, a woman who refused to be quiet. She didn't just break the rules, she broke expectations. And for that, she remains one of the most controversial figures in music history. Number 3, Nina Simone.
Lord, please don't let me be misunderstood.
Nina Simone had one of those voices that could command a room's attention instantly. She didn't just play the piano, she conjured entire worlds from its keys. And when she spoke, she didn't whisper, she roared. In the 1960s, at the height of the civil rights movement, most black artists treaded carefully. They walked a tightrope between success and speaking out. But Simone, she jumped off the tightrope. It started with Mississippi God, a song that didn't just push boundaries, it obliterated them. Released in 1964, it was a furious, biting response to the murder of Medgar Evers and the Birmingham church bombing that killed 4 black girls. It wasn't veiled in metaphor. It was direct, unapologetic, angry. Southern radio stations refused to play it. Some smashed the record on air. Simone didn't care. That was just the beginning. She became the voice of revolution. Her music, a soundtrack to the struggle, 4 women exposed the painful stereotypes forced upon black women. To be young, gifted, and black became an anthem of pride. She performed at civil rights rallies, marched with activists, stood alongside Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. But activism came at a cost. Simone's career suffered. White audiences who once adored her for sultry ballads like I Put a Spell on You now saw her as dangerous. Blacklisting followed. Radio stations stopped playing her music. Concert opportunities dwindled. The industry turned its back on her. And then there was Nina herself. She was volatile, unpredictable. Stories of backstage rants, erratic behavior, and explosive arguments followed her wherever she went. In later years, it became clear she was battling undiagnosed bipolar disorder. But at the time, she was simply labeled difficult. By the late 70s, Simone had disappeared from the US music scene. She lived in Barbados, Liberia, then France, performing sporadically. She was broke, frustrated, and furious at an industry that had discarded her. But time has a way of revealing the truth. Today, Nina Simone is revered as a pioneer, an artist who never compromised, a woman who risked everything to tell the truth. She wasn't just controversial, she was necessary. Number 4, Grace Slick.
Chasing rabbits, and you know you're going to.
Grace Slick didn't believe in rules, not in life, not in music, and certainly not in rock and roll. As the front woman of Jefferson Airplane, she was the face of the psychedelic counterculture, sharp-tongued, wild-eyed, and always just a little dangerous. While other female rockers were expected to be ethereal or seductive, Grace was something else entirely. She was a warrior in leather pants, armed with a microphone and a mind sharpened like a switchblade. Her voice was a hypnotic siren call, leading listeners down a rabbit hole of rebellion. White Rabbit, the band's signature track, wasn't just a song, it was a psychedelic manifesto, a coded call to arms wrapped in Lewis Carroll imagery. It slipped past censors, flooding mainstream radio with drug references at a time when America was desperately clinging to its post-war innocence. But it wasn't just the music that made Grace a controversy magnet, it was her life. She drank like a sailor, partied harder than most of her male counterparts, and had zero patience for authority. She was openly sexual, unapologetically political, and brazenly unfiltered. If she had a thought, the world was going to hear it. And then there was the Nixon incident. In 1970, Grace was invited to a White House event for alumni of Finch College, a private school she once attended. She saw an opportunity. The plan was to sneak LSD into President Nixon's tea. She even brought Abby Hoffman, the infamous Yippie activist, as her +1. But before she could carry out the psychedelic coup, security recognized her and stopped her at the door. Perhaps she wasn't slick enough that day, so no tea party for Tricky Dick. The years that followed were a blur of chaos, arrests, drunken incidents, public feuds. Grace was a walking controversy. She once tried to perform at a German show while blackout drunk, slurring insults at the crowd until they booed her off stage. She was unpredictable, untamed, and wildly entertaining. By the late 70s, she took a step back from the spotlight, later reinventing herself as a painter. But make no mistake, Grace Slick wasn't just another rock star. She was an explosion in human form, and every boundary she broke made the world just a little less square. Number 5. Cher.
Half-breed, that's all I ever heard. Half-breed.
Cher wasn't just a singer. She was a cultural revolution wrapped in sequins. By the late 1960s, she had already built a career as half of Sonny and Cher, the duo that gave the world I Got You Babe. But as America cooed over their wholesome, folksy love story, Cher was quietly breaking every rule in the book. First, there was the attitude. While most female artists were expected to be sweet and submissive, Cher dripped with sarcasm, wit, and a don't-give-a-damn attitude that set her apart. She didn't just stand next to Sonny, she outshined him, cracking jokes at his expense on national television and making it clear she was nobody's sidekick. Then there was the fashion. In an era when women in music were supposed to be demure, Cher strutted onto TV screens in barely there outfits that scandalized middle America. Feathers, sequins, body-hugging jumpsuits, she turned every performance into a visual spectacle. By the time she performed Half-Breed in 1973, dressed in a beaded Native American headdress, outrage exploded. The song, which told the story of a woman struggling with her mixed-race identity, was a chart-topping hit, but critics slammed it for cultural insensitivity. And yet, she refused to apologize. Cher wasn't just pushing boundaries, she was bulldozing them. Her solo career soared, but so did the controversy. She divorced Sonny, unthinkable at the time, and made it clear she was ready to take charge of her own destiny. She dated rock stars, actors, men decades younger than her, all while continuing to reinvent herself with each passing year. By the late 70s, disco had taken over, and Cher dove in head first. But rock purists despised disco, and suddenly she was caught in the crossfire. Critics mocked her transition into the genre, and when the Disco Sucks movement hit, she became a target. But as always, Cher did what Cher does best. She outlasted them all. Decades later, the same rebellious spirit that made her controversial in the 60s and 70s would make her a legend. She wasn't just a singer. She was an era-defining force. Proof that reinvention is the ultimate act of defiance. Number 6. Marianne Faithfull.
When I stole a twig from our little nest and gave it to a bird.
Marianne Faithfull started as London's Golden Girl, a wide-eyed blonde with the voice of an angel in a fairy tale romance with Mick Jagger. But by the time the 70s rolled in, she had transformed into one of rock's darkest, most complex figures. Her descent into controversy began with the Redlands drug bust of 1967, a raid on Keith Richards' house where Marianne was found wearing nothing but a fur rug. Tabloids had a field day. The image of a naked Faithfull tangled in the Rolling Stones' hedonistic world became the scandal of the decade. From there, things only got wilder. She abandoned the delicate folk pop image that made her famous, diving headfirst into sex, drugs, and raw, unapologetic rock and roll. Her once sweet voice turned into a whiskey-soaked rasp, a transformation that mirrored her hard-living lifestyle. She fell into heroin addiction, became homeless, and nearly died in the process. But in 1979, she made the greatest comeback in rock history. Her album Broken English was a grenade, dark, political, and dripping with fury. Songs like Why'd You Do It were so explicit that they were banned in multiple countries. The album tackled drug addiction, failed relationships, and the ugly truths of life with brutal honesty. Marianne Faithfull had transformed from a 1960s ingenue into rock's ultimate survivor. And that, more than anything, made her one of the most controversial women of her time. Number 7. Tina Turner. Tina Turner's voice was a force of nature, raw, electric, unstoppable. But behind the powerhouse vocals and dazzling stage presence was a woman fighting for her life. In the 1960s and 70s, Tina was half of Ike and Tina Turner Revue, a duo known for their explosive performances and hits like Proud Mary. On stage, she was untouchable, a lioness prowling in sequined fringe, whipping audiences into a frenzy. But off stage, she lived in a private hell. Ike Turner was not just her musical partner, he was her abuser. The details of the violence she endured remained hidden for years, masked by the industry's relentless push to maintain their star image. But those close to Tina knew the truth. Ike controlled every aspect of her life, her money, her music, even her name. If she stepped out of line, he beat her mercilessly. For years she endured, and then one night in 1976 she ran for her life. Escaping with 36 cents in her pocket and nothing else, she hid in a cheap motel, filed for divorce, and left with only her name. The industry doubted she could survive without Ike. They were wrong. But even as she fought to rebuild her career, controversy followed her. When she finally told her story in a 1981 interview, the world wasn't ready to hear it. Many dismissed her as exaggerating. Some even blamed her. The music industry had protected Ike for years, and now they were hesitant to embrace a woman who was calling him out. But she didn't stop. Her memoir, I, Tina, 1986, and the film What's Love Got to Do with It, 1993, exposed the abuse in brutal detail. And suddenly, the world listened. Her courage changed the way we talk about domestic violence, turning her personal pain into a rallying cry. By the late 70s, she had become one of rock's greatest comeback stories, rebuilding herself from the ground up, and eventually releasing Private Dancer 1984, the album that turned her into a global icon. Tina Turner wasn't just a survivor, she was a warrior, and in an era where women were often silenced, she had the audacity to speak the truth. Number 8. Etta James. Etta James had a voice that could shake the heavens and break your heart in the same breath. But behind the velvet growl and the iconic ballads was a woman who refused to be tamed, no matter how hard the world tried. At the time she belted out At Last, she had already lived more than most. Raised on the rough streets of Los Angeles, Etta was a fighter from the start. She was one of the few women in the male-dominated world of early R&B, and she didn't just hold her own, she demanded respect. But Etta's career was as turbulent as her voice was powerful. She was addicted to heroin for most of the 60s and 70s, cycling in and out of rehab. She clashed with record executives, refusing to conform to the industry's expectations. She had violent feuds with other artists, including Diana Ross, who she openly despised. And then there was the Beyoncé incident. In 2008, Beyoncé portrayed Etta in the film Cadillac Records, a role that Etta never approved of. When Beyoncé performed At Last at Barack Obama's inauguration, Etta was furious. She went on a scathing rant declaring, "That woman can't sing my song. She's gonna get her whooped." The industry was stunned. Beyoncé was America's sweetheart, and Etta's outburst made headlines. But for those who knew her, it was classic Etta, unfiltered, unbothered, and unwilling to let anyone take what was hers. She lived her life on her own terms, burning bridges and defying expectations until the very end. And in doing so, she became one of the most formidable voices in music history. Number 9. Cass Elliot. In the 1960s, women in music were expected to be thin, glamorous, and conventionally beautiful. Cass Elliot, she was none of those things, and that made her one of the most controversial women of her era. As the powerhouse voice of the Mamas and the Papas, Cass, better known as Mama Cass, stood front and center. Her voice was monumental, carrying songs like California Dreamin' and Make Your Own Kind of Music into mega hits. But instead of focusing on her earth-shattering talent, the media obsessed over her weight. She was constantly mocked, ridiculed, and underestimated, not just by the press, but sometimes by her own bandmates. In a world that celebrated waif-like figures, Cass was considered too big to be a star, and yet she was a star. a brilliant, magnetic, unstoppable force. But the fat shaming never stopped. When she died in 1974 at just 32, the tabloids spread a cruel false rumor that she had choked to death on a ham sandwich. It wasn't true, but the joke stuck, overshadowing her legacy. Even in death, the world tried to reduce her to a punchline. To cast Elliot's real legacy, she redefined what a leading woman in music could look like. She sang like no one else, lived life boldly and unapologetically, and paved the way for future artists to embrace their own individuality on their own terms. Number 10. Joan Baez.
We shall overcome.
Joan Baez didn't just sing about change, she was change. With her sublime voice and Spanish guitar, she could have easily carved out a peaceful, controversy-free career as a folk singer. Instead, she became one of the most politically charged artists of the 60s and 70s, and in the process, one of the most controversial. Baez's music was inseparable from her activism. She didn't just sing protest songs, she stood on the front lines. While other artists played it safe, Joan was marching with Martin Luther King Jr., getting arrested for resisting the Vietnam War, and calling out injustice at every turn. And people hated her for it. When she refused to pay taxes because they funded the war, the government seized her income. When she stood up for civil rights, she was blacklisted from TV networks. When she toured with Bob Dylan, their political messages got them banned from multiple venues. But it wasn't just politics that made Baez a magnet for controversy. It was a refusal to fit into any mold. She was a folk artist who openly embraced rock and pop. She was a pacifist in a violent era. A woman who didn't just sing about injustice but risked her career to fight it. And when the folk purists turned on Dylan for going electric at Newport in 1965, Baez stayed by his side, refusing to bow to tradition. Then came the personal scandals. Her high-profile relationship with Dylan was messy. She helped launch his career, only for him to treat her like an afterthought. When she wrote Diamonds and Rust, a devastating ballad about their love affair, Dylan fans tore into her. Some accused her of exploiting their past, others saw her as bitter and vengeful. Yet Baez never cared about public approval. She wasn't in music for fame, she was in it to speak truth to power, even when it cost her everything. Decades later, her influence remains undeniable. She proved that music could be a weapon, and that artists should take a stand. She was never afraid to be loud, difficult, or divisive, and that's exactly why she mattered. These 10 women didn't just make music, they made history. They shattered expectations, they pushed against the rules, they sparked controversies simply by existing on their own terms. Some were mocked, some were silenced, some were punished for their defiance, but all of them changed the game, and that's why their stories still matter. If controversy creates legends, then which of these women left the biggest mark? Drop your thoughts in the comments down below. Hit the like button if you loved the ride, and subscribe for more amazing videos like this. We'll see you in the next one.